Hey guys, it's Oakley, and we'll be doing a video on sieges and cities, sort of in the Warhammer world, and I have with me Arch Warhammer and Grey Hunter. So this is going to be a relatively long video, there's a lot to discuss, and we're here now zooming in from the world map down to the old world, because that is where CA has confirmed the game trilogy is going to be taking place here. And actually, you can find in the comments link below a link actually to this whole map. It's super in depth and it has all the cities that you can zoom into. And then I basically worked with Arch to put in the main factions sort of where they are territorially. So for example, the Empire stretching here. We still don't know how this is going to be broken up. Do you control all of it or parts of it? Then you would have the Vampire counts. Again, this is always just an approximation. We don't quite know how big these territories are going to be, but at least this gives you a ballpark, or at least an estimate of where things stand. Then you would have the dwarves stretched out in a fashion like this, with their strongholds listed here, but again they have other Karaks and strongholds in various places. And then after this comes the greenskins. As the guys will mention to you in a little bit, the greenskins don't really have territory. They're basically everywhere, but this is mostly where you're going to find them in the Badlands and territories like that. And now I'll turn it over to these guys as we cover some of the minor factions that you might be seeing in these game iterations.
First up, we've got Kislev, which is essentially based on a mix of Polish and Russian units, using mostly melee weapons with a few black powder weapons thrown in.
And next up, we have Bretonia. Basically King Arthur on steroids. Lots and lots of knights. Lots and lots of downtrodden peasants.
Albion, essentially the British Isles, filled with Celts and all manners of half-naked barbarians. Not much covered in Warhammer lore, but they might be here as a neutral faction.
On the other hand, Standing Stone Circles and Druids. The Wood Elves, they're basically Orlando Bloom in Lord of the Rings.
And the Border Princes are a bunch of merchants and various self-appointed princes.
Hence Border Princes. Telea is the home of the mercenary. They're basically Italian city-states. And Estalia, Spain.
Yeah, so that was quite a quick overview of all of them. We'll do a separate geopolitics and faction overview in the future. We just wanted to kind of lay it all out for you guys. I know a lot of you are new to it. But now let's go ahead and dive into the specifics of each of the different main factions and flesh out the differences in the city. So for example, we're going to be taking a look, as I said, Empire right here, and then zooming into the sort of the lore version of what the map looks like in a little bit. So I guess I'll let you guys start to discuss a little bit of the Empire dynamics.
Well,
It's
I
the
guess we
Holy
can
Roman
just start
Empire.
with the it's the Holy Roman Empire, divided into the principalities, so to say.
There's 14 states. Each of them is ruled by an elector count. And then you've got the Moot, which is just kind of hanging out there near Stirland. Hobbits.
And primarily it's
It's
going to be
basically hobbits.
it's in a forested region, so that's why you're going to see cities for the Empire mostly be like fortified medieval towns, I guess.
Yeah,
Mostly,
there
yeah.
is.
They're
One of you.
Yeah, we're probably gonna have to decide some kind of speaking order for this.
That's all right. We'll chime in one after the other. So I guess first is going to be Altdorf, which is primarily the capital, and I guess Grey Hunter, if you want to touch on that, if we want to set an order.
Ah, sure. It's the capital of the Empire currently. The Empire's capital switches around a lot because the Emperor is picked from his fellow elector counts. But Altdorf is kind of special because it is also the place where Sigmar, who created the Empire, lived and was born, and all that other fun stuff. It lives on the River Reich, which was that big river running right through the city. And basically think of it as medieval Berlin. It's very, very powerful. It's got a lot of infrastructure, and it's guarded by lots of Germans.
And then Arch, if you had any comments on what to expect if you're taking the city, or what to expect in terms of the buildings and defenses.
Well, in terms of defenses, it's a relatively simple single curtain wall, but it is of course staffed by a rather considerable amount of angry Germans, as Grey Hunter so stated. Plus, it is the center of the Empire religion, the Church of Sigma, which means it'll also be staffed to the rafters with batshit insane religious zealots, which is always fun to be assaulting.
And when we were talking about this before, you guys had likened it to maybe Rome, for instance, the capital city with an outer curtain wall, river running through it. It looks very similar, and here you can infiltrate various sectors of the city, so it might be similar to taking on Rome. And then,
Yeah, very similar, I think.
and then,
It's
sorry.
Nothing too special, nothing crazy in that. like dragons or giant cannons or anything insane like that.
Right, and that's a good segue to where we're headed now, which is going to be a little bit more to the north.
Yes. Do you want to take some of this, Arch?
I'll take it. The city of Middenheim, also known as the City of the White Wolf, the seat of the Ulrich, the second greatest religion of the Empire, the worship of Ulrich, the god of winter, wolves, and warfare, and all of that nastiness. It is a heavily fortified city with several layers of curtains walls and considerable bastions, with many towers and cannons and an absolute ton of troops, and it needs to have all of these defenses because it has been under siege several times by the forces of chaos, as you can see here, and by the clear sight that you have troops climbing the walls with hooks. Well, they don't play by the normal rules, and so any fortifications that have any kind of hope of withstanding that kind of siege needs to be rather special indeed, like, for example, the Great Cannon of Middenheim that requires a giant to load it, a crew of a few dozen to even just load it with powder, and as you can see down the bottom there, an absolute ton of horses to actually move the thing on its carriage.
So that might be something if you upgrade your city further and further. This might be the top tier defensive installation you can get in your
This
city.
would be a fairly far FU weapon, yes.
Right. And you guys were telling me before this is not geared towards troop formations, but individual enemy units.
Yes, when you're
Yeah,
dealing with things like greater demons, just
big
shooting it with a
things.
normal cannon might tickle it, but if you hit it with this thing, odds are it's going to be going back to the warp where it belongs.
That's right.
Probably.
And
Something cool about Middenheim as well is that it's built on this rock called the Rock because we're really, really imaginative. But the rock is really, really, really tall. Like
it's very hard to
many, many
access.
hundreds of feet tall.
Hmm.
And
To get to
infested with
Middenheim, you
Skaven.
have to climb causeways. This thing's serious business.
So that's going to be a hell of an approach. And I guess moving on to the next faction is the Vampire Counts. So at this point, we're not really sure how they're going to flesh them out in the game because, sort of according to the lore, they're much, much smaller than the Empire by comparison. Most of the vampires, you guys were telling me, do live amongst the humans, except for some of them which have been sort of forming their own nation in East Stirland and around the Moot. And what we can expect from their castles, I guess I'll hand this over to one of you. You guys talked about the differences in the castles.
Well, first off, the vampire counts themselves, who are actually vampire counts, used to be part of the Empire.
I see.
They live in the old province of Sylvania. Then they became vampires, and as we all know, when vampires become vampires, bad things happen. People get scared. Their architecture is a lot more gothic. The Empire's architecture is already gothic, but these guys take it to a whole new extreme. It's like gargoyles everywhere.
So we could
This
expect
is serious underworld stuff.
the walls to be pretty fortified. It's kind of like an Empire heavy city, but they've had more time to work on it with sort of people who don't workers who don't need food or rest, so they can build it up
And
larger.
90% of the defenders are immortal. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a lot tougher of a nut to crack.
So if I'm
And
attacking
being
a human heavy city versus a vampire heavy fortress, the fortress in this case, it's being defended by people who don't need to eat or sleep. So you guys had talked about maybe it has bonuses versus agents because the sentries don't sleep. And then in terms of being able to hold out longer, obviously the undead can hold out longer. And then the people besieging it are going to be besieging it from, marshy ground where they're going to be under assault from the undead rising. So a pretty hard
Most definitely.
area to take.
And every man you lose in a siege gets added to the defenders.
So that's a
Pretty much.
completely different dynamic, not just the defenses, but how a siege progresses. Um,
Yep.
and then the next one is going to be us moving on to the dwarves. The dwarves don't really have established cities outside so much. Mostly they're going to be karaks, which are built into the mountains themselves, deep underground tunnels. But the main entrance is going to be a huge fortified gate, often with a ring of defenses around it, and very, very small channels that direct you towards the entrance. So this is mostly what you're facing when you come up to a dwarf fortress. So if you guys could touch on how this is different from a human heavy fortress or even a vampire heavy fortress.
Well, the obvious difference is the simple fact that it's built by the dwarfs, and therefore built to a considerably greater standard, and they've been around longer. The dwarfs have been building their cities, or karaks, for thousands of years. They stretch incredible distances below the earth. You could almost compare them to icebergs, where only about a tenth of them are actually above ground in this case. And they
Tenth
are
is generous.
ludicrously, Yes, generous. They are ludicrously heavily fortified. Like, you could compare a Dwarven Karak to any city in history, and it would be found woefully lacking in comparison. The dwarves take their security very, very seriously indeed, to the point where they have even fortified the vast majority of the mountain passes around their Karaks. So taking one is, first you've got to get to it, then you've got to get through the outer walls, then you've got to get actually into the Karak itself, and once you've beaten through all of that, all of the defenders, then at some point you might actually reach the civilian sectors and be capable of actually inflicting a little bit of damage onto the massive edifice that is a Dwarven Karak.
So we could expect city mechanics to have to be something like escalation in Attila, and then as far as the teaser goes, maybe even fighting underground. We'll have to see, how that plays out, though.
Well, if
We
you
would
think
hope
about
so.
yeah, if you think about a dwarven Karak as one of those Russian dolls, a Karak is a castle and a castle and a castle and a castle in a castle in a castle. If you're lucky, if you're not, there's a lot more layers. Serious business.
So hopefully CA will implement specific siege mechanics for these different factions, because we're already starting to see how they all play out differently. And specifically, if you want to be true to the lore of these Karaks not being able to be wiped out by just a couple people burning down gates, as we've seen in the past, they're definitely going to have to pay special attention to sieges.
Definitely.
If I see someone throw a torch at that gate that is the size of several minibuses stacked on top of each other, I will take a torch to CA.
Yeah. Yeah, so hopefully we can expect a breath of new life breathed into sieges. Already escalation and Attila help make them more fun, but hopefully the dynamics of Warhammer will change up sieges. Um, Speaking about sieges, don't expect to see the orcs besiege too much. They're going to be the people attacking cities. Mostly their encampments are going to be sort of moving places that can be built up, taken apart, transported, and then built up again. So you'd be seeing more fortified sort of encampments like this. And we talked about earlier before we recorded, maybe having the ability of, if your army is sitting in one place for a longer period of time, maybe your little encampment can build up more and more fortifications to be a little bit more formidable.
They're definitely going to be more of a horde army than a stand and fight army. So the Empire, the dwarves, and to an extent the vampire counts like to sit behind their walls and just outlast the enemy. The orcs don't really like doing that, seeing as the whole politics of the orc leadership is I'm the biggest, I'm the strongest, I've bashed the most heads.
Mm-hmm.
They're basically your bows.
So if these
They're
guys,
not going to
Lock them
be.
up in a wall, that bad things happen. If you have
Yeah,
a ton of angry people locked in a very confined space, it's only a question of time before they start getting angry with each other, and soon they'll be killing more of each other than the defenders or the attackers could ever manage.
so then the question
well,
is, if these
orcs
guys
do that anyway.
are attacking for the most part, what happens when they take over a human or a dwarf city? They aren't really going to use those buildings. It looks like they're more going to occupy them.
They're going to turn it into a magnificently sized rubbish heap.
Right.
Pretty much.
So maybe it would be a case of orcs moving into a city, and instead of you managing that city, maybe as the orcs, you then start slowly sapping resources from the existing city and infrastructure itself. So again, another interesting mechanic that could be played out. And then I guess
They
now,
play
or go ahead.
they play very much like a horde army.
Hmm.
They probably would have more of a sacking a settlement than moving into it,
Hmm.
if anything.
And then now I guess we'll talk a little bit about the variety of siege equipment we might be seeing in the game.
Which we've got
Well, the
a ton
Empire and
of.
dwarves have guns. We
Of
did it
course,
again,
we have
didn't we?
cannons. Trebuchets, stone throwers, catapults, ballistias, cannons, all manners of wonderfulness, and of course, siege towers, rams, medieval Europe stuff, and then occasionally something properly batshit insane, like the orcs cobbling together a giant-ass wooden giant along the lines of what you see here, with a tree trunk, literally just a giant tree trunk for a ram.
Hmm.
And sometimes they set fire to them because stupid.
So it's
Hey, you set fire to the gates? That's not stupid. That's smart.
So it seems like we'll be seeing totally different mechanics for sieges, not only in terms of how each, different faction sets up its defenses, but also how each faction will attack it. And then once, a side is attacking and a side is defending, the combination of those two will interact differently. So hopefully we've been able to flesh that out a little bit more for you guys. So a lot of details. We're going to have to, wait and see that sort of how CA has played this out. But potentially you get a lot of asymmetry coming into this game, which I think is pretty exciting.
Of course, you've got to mention also the fact that there might be flying units, which could put a siege right on its head, so we'll have to see how they decide to deal with that.
That's right. And then heroes and magic and counter magic and all sorts of things that could start going on for defensive strategies.
Definitely. And the fact that each faction that they've announced so far attacks and defends very, very differently. Like the orcs don't have cannons. The Empire and the Dwarves do. But the vampire counts don't either. They generally rely on their magic.
Hmm. So
So everyone's going to be very different.
So it could be interesting as well if you're managing your empire and you find yourself at war with one faction versus another. Maybe you have to tailor your defenses more so for defense against magic or defense against siege equipment. So maybe that'll be another interesting take on cities as well.
I definitely think so.
Hmm. Okay.
There's going to be a lot more variation between factions than really there ever has been before in a Total War game, which is nice, but at the same time very scary because can they do it?
Right.
Can they do it indeed? Because we're no longer talking about Germanics fighting Romans. This is a whole another ball game.
Yeah. So
Well, the Germans are in there.
that's
The
right.
Empire represent.
Which is going to be interesting. So if you're used to sort of the way Total War sieges usually work, well then maybe you want to pick Empire and maybe you're attacking Bretonia possibly. Then you're a little familiar with that. So we'll see if CA can work out the dynamics. But they do have a trilogy to work that out, and hopefully they'll baby step this, and we'll be seeing a lot of
That's our
community
mantra
support.
now.
Yeah,
It's just if CA can do it. If CA can do it.
right. So
It's like a prayer.
yeah. So I guess we'll wrap it there. We've been rambling long enough. Hopefully this gives you an idea of what to expect from the different factions and sieges and cities. But if you want more details, obviously check out both of these guys' channel, Grey Hunter and Arch Warhammer. They do great faction recaps, and we hope to bring you guys more of these videos in the future. So thanks so much for watching. Check the links below for all the links that we mentioned. See you guys.